snack foods can be almost impossible to put down. You can't just eat one, and that's not accidental. And food companies literally hire teams of scientists to make the foods irresistible.
Yeah, it's literally called the bliss point. It's the perfect combination of salt, sugar, and fats that hijacks our dopamine system, that contrasts, really lights up our reward centers in our brain. Welcome to MD Longevity Lab, where we're playing the long game. This is a podcast where science meets real life with expert insights, practical tips, and real-world tools to not only live longer, but live better. Our aim is to radically change the way medicine is practiced and enable individuals to age gracefully, maintaining health span and vitality well into their later years. We're your hosts, Dr. Nisha and Dr. Vikas Patel, physicians, partners in life, and parents balancing work, wellness, and everything in between. Let's dive in. Welcome back to the MD Longevity Lab podcast, where we are playing the long game. I am your host, Dr. Vikas Patel, and I am joined by my wonderful, beautiful, smart co-host, Dr. Nisha Patel.
He had to say that.
I'm being paid to say it. All right. So today we are going to be covering a favorite topic of mine, ultra-processed foods.
Let's face it, ultra-processed foods are the new norm. And we want to unpack why that matters. So we'll abbreviate ultra-processed foods in this episode as UPFs. And UPFs are directly linked to cancer, metabolic dysfunction, cardiovascular disease, and dementia. These 4 chronic conditions that affect 95% of our population. And we want to emphasize this isn't about fear or perfection. It's about raising awareness and making small, better choices that stack up over time.
Today's episode is all about how ultra-processed foods are kind of rewiring our biology and honestly just shaving years off of our health span. This one's a must listen if you've ever struggled with cravings or energy crashes and really most chronic medical conditions. And I will start with a confession. Last night, I ate a pint of mint chocolate chip ice cream while watching a movie with our kids. We watched The Minority Report, which they found fascinating.
Yeah, we love watching old 80s and 90s movies with our kids. And they're like, wait, I don't even understand. Why are there wires attached to phones? It's really funny to hear their commentary. Anyway, you did end up washing it down with every ER doctor's kryptonite, which is Flamin Hot Cheetos.
Wow. Flamin Hot Cheetos are kind of the bane of ER doctors' existence because for some reason, every ER's vending machine has Flamin Hot Cheetos in it. And so the unofficial sign is Flamin Hot Cheeto sign, which is like the powder around the lips, around the fingertips. And invariably, that patient is there for vomiting or abdominal pain. But I digress. Let's just cover a brief history of what food really looked like, say, 75 years ago. Food before the 1950s was basically local, seasonal, made from scratch, and generally unprocessed. It wasn't really until post-World War II America that we had this need for shelf-stable convenience. And really in the 1950s through the 70s, that's when we had this full-on explosion of developing preservatives, frozen dinners, and really made this switch to factory farming. So UPFs didn't really exist before this era. They're really a byproduct of really modern industrialization.
Yep. Our grandparents wouldn't even recognize half of the things in our modern grocery stores today. They ate meat, potatoes, seasonal vegetables, and they weren't snacking constantly. So somehow we've replaced real food with edible
products.
Yeah.
So we'll start off with a couple stats here. In the US, greater than 60% of calories in the average American diet are coming from ultra-processed foods. Among children and adolescents, it's really nearly 70% of calories are coming from ultra-processed foods. From 2001 till 2018, UPF consumption in US adults increased from 53% to 57% of total calories, and it's just gone up since then.
Yeah, and I want to touch on a key NIH trial that got published in 2019. And this was a study that compared consumption of ultra processed foods to consumption of whole foods. The study overview, they looked at adults and the average BMI was 27. And the protocol, they had these patients for 2 weeks consume unlimited ultra processed foods. And then they had the same participants consume 2 weeks of whole foods. And these participants could have any amount for each of those sets of 2 weeks. And, the key findings were pretty alarming. What they found was that average caloric intake was 500 calories higher for the 2-week period where patients were consuming ultra processed foods, 500 calories per day. Patients in that 2-week period of consuming ultra processed foods gained an average of 2 pounds over that 2-week period. And patients that were consuming whole foods for that 2 weeks period of time lost a net of 2 pounds. So those are pretty significant statistics. And that was just over a 2-week period. And what we saw in those 500 calorie increases for those ultra processed food consumption, those extra calories were driven by carb consumption and fat consumption. And the eating rates were increased. So that means the pace at which people were consuming these ultra processed foods were high.
Yeah, we're going to kind of get into a little bit about why this study actually shows these market differences. And you should be able to understand that by the end of this podcast.
Yeah, so let's start with some definitions. What is an ultra processed food?
Okay, so let's define what ultra processed foods are. They have a classification system that Brazilian researchers came up with. It's called the NOVA classification, meaning new classification. And the NOVA classification has 4 different categories for food. So NOVA 1 is basically unprocessed or minimally processed food. So this really includes fruits, vegetables, fresh cuts of meat. NOVA 2 is going to be processed culinary ingredients. And so these are things that we're getting from nature, but they do have some level of minimal processing, such as getting olive oil from olives or sugar from sugarcane, salt, spices. These are all considered NOVA 2 classification. Processed foods in the NOVA 3 classification are so anything that comes inside of a can, anything that is already cooked that has a shorter shelf life. And then the NOVA 4, which is where we really get into trouble, are the ultra processed foods. And these are the ones that in general have a bunch of ingredients that you can't pronounce. And so these are not things that are coming from nature. These are things that definitely require some type of food lab to develop. So this includes chips, lunch meats, bread, pasta, cereals, candy bars, anything that likely tastes good.
Yep. So UPFs are not just processed, they're specifically formulated for taste. And they usually contain ingredients, like Vikas said, that you wouldn't normally use at home. So these are emulsifiers, color stabilizers, flavor enhancers, artificial sweeteners, and hydrolyzed proteins. And these are things that create longer shelf life. I think an important thing to know, we talk about food engineering, and snack foods can be almost impossible to put down. You can't just eat one, and that's not accidental. And food companies literally hire teams of scientists to make the foods irresistible.
Yeah, it's literally called the bliss point. So it's the perfect combination of salt, sugar, and fats that hijacks our dopamine system. And there's even a science to how the food feels inside of our mouth, and that's called mouthfeel. That contrasts really lights up our reward centers in our brain, right? So just like when you open up a can of soda, that little crisp sound that occurs, or the crunch of a Doritos chip. So these are all things that essentially wire us to think of a perceived freshness that's going to be more enjoyable. And it actually engages all of our senses to make us keep wanting to eat.
Yep. And colors matter too. So those bright colors signal flavor intensity, the same reason why Fruit Loops here literally embody every single color of the rainbow. And when we've taken our kids to Europe, they're like, these don't look like Fruit Loops. They taste great. They're more like the colors out of the 80s that we had.
There's another layer to this, right? So there's an actual ideal carb to fat ratio in food. The studies show that roughly a 1-to-1 ratio of carbs to fats really triggers the most reward in the human brain. It's how you get people to love sweets and get them hooked on cookies. And for people who really love savory snacks, this is how you hook them into like cheesy dip with chips. That combination, that 1-to-1 combination doesn't really exist in nature. And it's only in our man-made processed foods. And so this is how, when a food scientist is designing a food, they're looking to get close to that ratio to know that the mass population is going to actually enjoy it.
Yeah. So whether you have a sweet tooth or you're a salty snack person, there's a perfectly engineered food designed to keep you coming back for more.
Yeah. So one of the other things that I think matters is really caloric density. So this is literally the number of calories per gram of food. UPFs are hyper dense in this area. They are high in calories, low in fiber, and generally low in water content.
Yeah. So a small volume of food can pack a huge caloric punch. And that's the same reason why we can ingest 200 calories of potato chips and still keep going back for more. Whereas 200 calories of an apple, like we're full after that.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the exact reason how I finished an entire pint of Graeter's and chocolate chip ice cream last night, because I can eat so much of it without getting any of the satiety markers that tell my brain that, all right, I've had enough. I literally finished off 1,100 calories of ice cream in one sitting. And to your previous point, how could somebody sit down and just eat 1,100 calories of strawberries or apples? They would get pretty full. The reason is that most of our regular food has these other things that give our brain that satiety mechanism. So essentially, our whole foods have fiber, protein, and water, and all of those things are increasing volume and telling our brain that, hey, we've had enough, while my mint and chocolate chip ice cream did not.
And that lack of fiber is huge. So the natural fiber that's found in vegetables, fruits, beans, and whole grains, it doesn't only keep us youthful, it regulates our blood sugar, it feeds our healthy gut bacteria. And so when fiber and those important nutrients are stripped out, your gut lining becomes more vulnerable to damage and inflammation increases. So over time, that can contribute to metabolic dysfunction, autoimmune dysregulation, and even cancer development. And so now you start to see when the average American diet consists of 70, 80% of ultra processed foods, now it really starts to matter.
This is, again, one of those big social media phenomenons, right? The leaky gut syndrome. Most of this leaky gut phenomena can really be attributed to what our American diet is. And though it's not the sexy thing to tell a patient that, hey, like you need to actually start eating whole foods, salads, fruits, whole grains, and your IBS symptoms will actually start to improve, because people, rightfully so, these other foods in the ultra processed category, they taste good and people don't want to give them up. But this is one of those main drivers of that leaky gut syndrome. Nish, why don't we touch a little bit about the cancer risk and some of the mechanisms here?
Yeah, so that's where it really starts to get serious. So a 2018 study followed over 100,000 people and found that every 10% increase in UPF consumption was associated with a 12% increase in cancer risk.
Yeah, so one of the culprits here is an additive like carrageenan. It's a thickening agent derived from red seaweed. It's used in processed dairy-free milks, yogurts, deli meats, desserts. In animal studies, carrageenan has been shown to promote intestinal inflammation and may actually contribute to colitis-like changes in the gut. That chronic inflammation has been linked to a much higher cancer risk.
Yes, UPFs also commonly include emulsifiers and artificial preservatives, and those disrupt the gut microbiome. And these chemical compounds reduce the diversity of the beneficial bacteria. So we've got good bacteria in our body and bad bacteria. And when there's a suppression of the good bacteria and an overgrowth of the bad bacteria, that's what kind of weakens that intestinal barrier and lets inflammatory molecules seep into our circulation. And that's a process that has come to be known as leaky gut.
Yeah, that low grade kind of chronic inflammation is a known driver of DNA damage. When cells are constantly under oxidative stress and inflammatory attack, then DNA replication becomes faulty, and those mutations that develop are really the things that drive accelerated aging and then in some cases malignancy. So UPFs aren't just linked to cancer, they're strongly tied to several chronic medical conditions, and several of which we've already discussed on previous episodes. But it's tied to type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, depression, as well as dementia.
Yep. So studies from France and Spain have shown that those who eat the most UPFs have a 62% increase of all-cause mortality. And what all-cause mortality is, we've touched on that definition in other episodes. That's your chance of dying of any given cause.
Even after you're adjusting for calories and body weight, UPFs increase metabolic risk. So that means even if people are eating the exact same amount of calories as a control, so everybody's eating a 2,000 calorie diet, the people on the UPF diet still have an increased risk of metabolic disease. So it's not really just about overeating, though UPFs do tend to cause people to overeat. It's actually about the quality of what we're eating.
Yeah, that study that I had mentioned that was conducted in the NIH showed that patients who were only eating a UPF diet were consuming 500 calories more. So let's talk about mental health for a second. Emerging data is also showing that these diets that are high in ultra-processed foods, especially sugary drinks and processed meats, are linked to higher rates of depression and cognitive decline.
There's been quite a bit of research lately about gut microbiome and depression, anxiety rates. And as it turns out, if you have low biodiversity of gut microbiome, which is directly related to UPFs, then you tend to have higher rates of depression and anxiety.
Yeah, so some real talk. How did we get here? So let's be honest, this isn't just about willpower. It feels like the deck is kind of stacked against us.
I think you're right. UPFs are cheaper, they're more convenient, they're shelf-stable, and they're literally everywhere. For working families juggling 1.5 million things, they're basically a lifeline for survival.
Yep. But UPFs are kind of a Trojan horse, right? They look like food, they taste like food, but they're not nourishing us. They're literally just draining us.
And I don't want to sound like this is just about fear. This is really more about awareness. Once you see how these foods are designed, you can start to take some of that power back and kind of make a little bit better decision.
The first step is really to crowd out UPFs with real food. And this doesn't mean you have to be perfect. There's certain ultra processed foods. For Vikas, it's ice cream. For me, it's like 40 different things, including ice cream.
Including, but not limited to.
Yes, I don't discriminate. I love ultra processed foods, but I also know that the majority of my diet cannot be comprised of ultra processed foods. So, and that's what we tell our kids too. Like, they love junk, but we kind of tell them, like, you have to think about it. If your plate is 100%, 80% of that plate has to be whole foods. Or let's say you're eating throughout the day. You have to remember that about 80% of your diet has to be coming from those whole foods. And that's fresh fruits, vegetables, lean meats, dairy products. And if you want to have that snack food or that sugary drink, you have to understand that that cannot be the majority of what you're consuming.
I think we noticed this when we had traveled to Europe, right? So some years back, we had taken a family trip to Germany and France, and we'd noticed how different kind of the food delivery is of all the mechanisms of getting food in Europe are just so different than here. They just have a different relationship with food than we do. Grocery stores aren't like the mega grocery stores that we have. It's not like Costco and Jewel Asco, Walmart, right? So it's all these like almost kind of smaller mom and pop shop style where they're sourcing their food from local farms and they don't really have these shelf stable foods that are just going to last the next year in your cabinet.
Yeah, when we went to Europe, we learned that they have to prove whether food is safe in order to market it. In the US, we have to prove that it's unsafe in order to take it off the market. So these food manufacturers here can literally put out any product, and it's not until several years later, if studies can prove that this is harmful to the public, that they limit it. We've seen it in these food dyes, in some of these seed oils and things like that. And it's really doing a disservice to our population.
I agreed. The second point here, so Nisha talked about the kind of 80-20 split of kind of whole foods versus UPFs. The second thing that I think is helpful is, well, how do we get the whole foods, right? So generally, when you walk into one of our traditional grocery stores in the States, it's everything on the periphery of the grocery store that's mostly safe, right? That's where all the fruits and vegetables are, all of the whole dairy products, the butcher section, right? It's all on the periphery of the grocery store. You're spending the majority of the time in the middle of the grocery store. That's where all the shelf stable stuff is. And that's generally the stuff that's causing us the most problems.
Yep. And the third thing is to look for ingredient lists. And you want to look for products that have either no ingredient list. So that's a fresh fruit or a vegetable or a meat where you know that's exactly what you're getting. Or if it doesn't have an ingredient list, you want to make sure they're ingredients that you recognize. And if you cannot pronounce it or wouldn't cook with it or don't have it in your kitchen, you can probably skip it. And I think it brings up an important point. We have a lot of patients that I hear, well, I only eat organic. You can still have an organic, ultra processed food. And so a lot of it is these mislabeled kid snacks where it'll say organic gummy fruit snacks for kids. Like there's no such thing as a gummy fruit snack that is not an ultra processed food. And it doesn't mean that your kids can never have them. It just means you have to recognize that this is 20% of their diet. This is not a healthy food for them. And same with some of these protein bars. We emphasize getting adequate protein in our patients' diets. And sometimes these protein bars make it sound like they're getting 12 grams of protein. This is huge, but you look at the label and that's a UPF 4. That's where the tricky part is. And we really need a better system for the general public to be able to recognize, you know what, I'd rather have a fresh fruit or vegetable with no protein, and that's better for me than this ultra processed food that may have 12 grams of protein.
Yeah, I contrast a little bit with what Nisha's saying with the protein bars. There are protein bars that are better quality than other ones, right? So if your protein bar has 12 grams of protein, but it has 200 calories, so 12 grams of protein, each gram of protein has essentially 4 calories of protein per gram. So if 12 times 4, right, you're only having 48 calories of your protein, 200 gram protein bar is actually coming from protein, then there's a lot of filler in there that you probably don't need. So that's where you have to kind of look at the label and see, well, does this make sense? It's absolutely necessary for most people if they're trying to hit a certain protein goal. They're going to have to eat some ultra processed protein source. As long as it's not the majority of the protein that they're getting, they have to be wise about, well, what else is in there? Getting an ultra processed protein from whey protein, for instance, that's ultra processed because they took whole milk and they separated out all of the fat, the carbs, and the protein. And then they're basically just drying out the protein and making it a powder. That's considered an ultra processed food because they had to do some processing, but it's basically just the protein that comes out of milk. And so that is not what I would consider a bad source, even though it's a UPF. But if all of a sudden that is being combined with a bunch of sugar to make it taste more palatable, and then throw in a bunch of fat to get that 1-to-1 carb to fat ratio, then you start to get into trouble. So that's where it becomes a little bit more nuanced and you got to pay attention to what's on the label. So the other thing that we like to do is cook more at home And we try to include our kids in it. And luckily, at least two out of our three kids like to help out with the cooking. But essentially, even if this is simple, you don't have to make the most elaborate meal, but homemade meals where you're using the things that we know are really healthy for us, increasing the olive oil content instead of some other seed oil, eating legumes and beans, which have a lot of protein and fiber, having more greens as part of our diet. Those are all really healthy ways to get rid of the ultra processed, and every single time it's going to beat what you take out of the freezer.
Yeah. And it might just be starting with cooking one meal a week. So this doesn't have to be every single night. And the goal is, okay, maybe I'm going to cook and eat one fresh meal per week. And then it might be I make 2 nights worth, and 2 dinners, I'm eating a fresh home cooked meal. And I think that's where you start to build on these habits. Your grocery lists tend to evolve. And we kind of started there. I mean, we're busy with the 3 kids, sports, school, us both working. It was very difficult at first to even process, how are we going to even cook? We're both exhausted by the time we get home. This is not happening. And you've got to start somewhere.
We definitely do a little bit of that batch cooking where any meal we make, we typically make enough for 2 nights, so that generally these are things that our kids actually like to eat, but are still healthy and include a lot of whole foods. But we'll usually make enough for 2 nights so that we're not cooking every night of the week.
Yep. And the fifth and last thing is, don't try to be perfect. Just try to be consistent. And we are not deprivationists by any stretch. Vikas and I and our kids all love yummy foods. Some of them are definitely ultra processed, but we also understand that that's a treat that can't be a staple of our diet. If we try and eliminate those completely, I know I personally will just reject it. Like if someone told me I can never have ice cream again or never have chocolate or chips, I'd be like, I'm not doing anything of what you're going to tell me to do.
It also leads to binge eating, right? So if you say, I'm not going to have this thing, when you do find it and you allow yourself to eat it, you tend to like grossly overeat, and then you go back to it over and over again. So there's no way to be perfect. I mean, it's great to try to be perfect, but the reality is that if you're able to kind of be consistent Monday through Friday, then you should cheat on the weekends. Like there's a point to living life, and it can't be just perfection every single day of the week. And so we certainly don't strive for perfection every single day of the week. Like we have our cheat days, and typically that's the weekend for us.
Yeah. And one of the last things I want to mention, I think the greatest gift that we can do is pass it forward. Like I grew up in the 80s. Well, you were born in the 70s. So you're a lot older than
Gen X.
Yeah. I think I'm a patient called me a geriatric millennial the other day. And I was like, what the hell is that? And apparently I am. I was born in 1982. So I am, in fact, a geriatric millennial. But
we're getting close to geriatrics anyway.
I think so. But we're redefining geriatrics.
That's right.
Geriatrics is the new, like, Gen. What's the newest Gen? Gen Alpha?
I think so.
Okay.
Our kids.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, the best gift we can give our kids is setting these healthy habits early on.
Yeah. So we've been surprised by our own children. They actually came to us and said, hey, we want to do this 70-day food challenge. And apparently they were inspired by their cousins who were doing the same thing. So what is it exactly that it entailed?
Their proposition was, Mom and Dad, if for 70 days we can give up ultra processed foods, we want $100.
Oh, that's right. It was money.
It was money. Of course. Money is their motivator.
Yeah.
They're hustlers.
Yeah. So we're actually almost at the end of this, right?
Yeah.
They only got about a week or so left, maybe 2 weeks left, but they basically gave up all the sugary snacks, all the ultra processed stuff. The only time that they get it is at special occasions. So when our son graduated 8th grade, or if it's someone's birthday or a holiday, then they get dessert that day. But otherwise, they've had some pretty amazing discipline this entire time. I think because we were talking about doing some of this podcasting stuff about ultra processed foods, and then them feeling like, oh, our cousins are doing it, so we can do it too.
Yeah. And it's amazing. I think it's helped them in how they look at food as more nourishing, more of a need than a want. And of course, they can want stuff. So it's been really fun to watch them make their choices and go for the water instead of the country time lemonade or Gatorade.
Yeah, they're literally like, I've seen them walk into the pantry, come out with something ultra processed, look at it, put it back, and then go to the fridge and pull out an apple. So it's definitely been fun for us to watch.
In the 80s, we grew up on Lunchables, Tang, like dough cooler, all that, like Chef Boyardee, like bologna and cheese sandwiches. And it wasn't even cheese. It was like that Kraft single slice cheese product that was individually packaged.
There's 8 ounces of milk in that. I remember the commercial.
That's what we grew up on. And so we're seeing the downstream effects of having grown up on processed foods. We were lucky enough that we grew up in immigrant households where our parents would yell at us if we did not eat the home-cooked Indian meal. But, you know, I would say most of our friends and things, it was like peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, bologna sandwiches, pastas, and all these processed foods. And we now are realizing we were deprived of so many fresh fruits and vegetables. But in our parents' defense, that was the age of convenience, right? Both moms and dads were working. So
this was new back then. Yeah. And the industry had just started to figure out how to make shelf-stable items, how to make them taste really good. Like food science became a thing from the 60s through the 80s. And so the downstream effect of that is what we're seeing today. And it completely changed our relationship with food in this country. And unfortunately, that trend is now spreading to the rest of the world. And we see these climbing obesity rates in all these other countries for the exact same reason as what that study that you mentioned earlier. It's just so easy to eat extra calories when you're eating ultra processed foods and you're doing it unintentionally. And so I think you're dead on here that if we teach our kids some of the habits that we wish we would have been taught right off the get-go, then they may avoid all of these chronic disease problems that our generation is facing.
Right. Like we didn't eat fresh apples. We ate Mott's applesauce. Like that was the
fruit roll-ups. It's like the same thing. Come on. Fruit by the foot.
Best. Oh, that was the best. No, but at MD Longevity Lab, we have seen the downstream effects in our patients: poor metabolic health, accelerated aging, and hormonal dysfunction.
Yeah. The good news is, our bodies are resilient. And so if we take a little effort to remove the daily insults and add back the proper nourishment, then you can completely transform that trajectory and get it right back on track where it's supposed to be.
Yep. And so remember, this podcast is about playing the long game. And sometimes that means putting down the Doritos or ice cream.
By keeping the real cheese.
Yep. I love real cheese instead of those Kraft singles.
All right. Thanks for tuning in. If you found this helpful, again, please share it with somebody who snacks like it's their job. But otherwise, we'll see you next time. I wasn't looking at it, so that you could go into the next sentence.
But you just said what I said, what I'm going to say. You wrote this.
I know, but I wasn't looking at it. I was looking at you.
But this is a podcast. You don't need to look at me.
Well, I thought we were eventually going to actually publish these on YouTube, which is what we have to do.
Yeah, but we're amateurs. We're just getting started out. So cart before the horse. You don't have to look at me. You can.
You're honestly, you're so. Thank you for playing the long game with MD Longevity Lab. You can visit us at www.mdlongevitylab.com to learn more about how we can support you on your journey. Stay connected with us on social media at MD Longevity Lab for tips, updates, and behind-the-scenes insights. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love it if you subscribed, left us a rating, or shared it with someone you know who's also playing the long game. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.